The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the pediatric ward like a gunshot. "Doctor!" Martinez dropped his clipboard, the papers scattering across the polished linoleum floor as he stared in disbelief at the scene unfolding before him. Security Officer Karen Hendricks, her face flushed with authority and rage, had just secured real police-grade handcuffs around the thin wrist of 10-year-old Brian Torres, chaining him to the metal bed rail like a common criminal. "Flight risk," Karen barked, her voice cutting through the usual gentle hum of the children's hospital. "This little troublemaker has been wandering these halls unsupervised for days. Someone needs to teach him about consequences." Brian's eyes, wide with confusion and fear, darted between the cold metal restraints and the imposing figure of the security officer. His small chest rose and fell rapidly, the heart monitor beside his bed registering his elevated pulse with increasingly urgent beeps. 3 days post-surgery. His body was still fragile, still healing from the complex cardiac procedure that had saved his life. The surgical scar running down his chest was hidden beneath his hospital gown, but the pain was written clearly across his round face. "Please," he whispered, tugging gently at the handcuffs. "I need to walk. The doctor said I need to walk." Karen's laugh was harsh, devoid of any warmth. "Walk? You've been sneaking around this hospital like you own the place, eating food from other patients' trays, bothering the staff, causing disruptions. That ends now." The truth was far different from Karen's accusations. Brian Torres was a model patient, perhaps too model for his own good. His mother, Maria, worked double shifts at a local restaurant to pay for his medical expenses, leaving Brian alone for long stretches during his recovery. The nursing staff had grown fond of the quiet, polite boy who never complained about his pain, who always said please and thank you, who lit up the entire ward with his shy smile. His cardiac surgeon, Dr. Patricia Lawson, had specifically prescribed regular walks around the pediatric floor as part of his recovery protocol. The gentle exercise helped prevent blood clots, maintained muscle strength, and boosted his spirits during the long, lonely hours of hospitalization. Brian had taken these instructions to heart, carefully timing his walks to avoid busy periods, always staying within the designated patient areas, never venturing beyond the clearly marked boundaries. But Karen Hendricks saw something different. Where others saw a sick child courageously fighting for his health, she saw defiance. Where the medical staff saw necessary therapeutic exercise, she saw unauthorized wandering. Her interpretation of Brian's compliance with doctor's orders had somehow twisted into a narrative of rebellion and disrespect. The pediatric ward of St. Catherine's Medical Center was usually a place of healing and hope. Colorful murals painted by local artists decorated the walls, depicting friendly animals and magical landscapes designed to comfort young patients during their most vulnerable moments. The nursing station was strategically positioned to provide clear sightlines down both corridors, ensuring constant supervision and rapid response to any emergency. Child life specialists moved through the halls with therapy dogs and art supplies, creating moments of joy amidst the clinical reality of serious illness. Brian had been admitted 5 days earlier for corrective heart surgery, a procedure to repair a congenital defect that had limited his activities throughout his young life. His mother, Maria, worked as a server at a family restaurant, her hands cracked from years of washing dishes and her back aching from long hours on her feet. She had saved every penny for months to afford the surgery, working extra shifts and skipping meals to ensure her son could have the operation he desperately needed. The night before his surgery, Brian had confessed to his mother that he was scared, not of the procedure itself, but of being a burden, of costing too much money, of not being worth the sacrifice she was making. Maria had held him close, tears streaming down her face as she promised him that he was worth everything, that she would move mountains to ensure his health and happiness. The surgery had been successful, but the recovery was proving challenging. Brian's body, weakened by years of cardiac insufficiency, needed time to adapt to his newly repaired heart. The prescribed walks were crucial, helping his cardiovascular system adjust while preventing the complications that could arise from prolonged bed rest. He approached these walks with the same determination he brought to everything in his life, making mental notes of his progress, counting steps, celebrating small victories. It was during one of these prescribed therapeutic walks that Karen Hendricks first encountered Brian. She had been patrolling the hospital corridors, clipboard in hand, looking for violations of the numerous policies and procedures that seemed to multiply weekly under her increasingly authoritarian interpretation of hospital security. When she spotted the overweight 10-year-old moving slowly down the hallway, supporting himself with one hand against the wall, she saw not a patient following medical orders, but an unsupervised child violating her conception of proper behavior. "Excuse me," she had called out, her voice sharp and accusatory. "Where are you supposed to be?" Brian had turned, his face immediately flushing with anxiety. "I'm walking," he had replied simply. "My doctor said I need to walk every few hours." Karen's eyes had narrowed. "Do you have supervision? Where's your nurse? Where's your parent?" "My mom is at work," Brian had explained, his voice growing smaller. "The nurses are busy. I'm just walking like the doctor said." That had been the beginning of Karen's fixation on Brian. Over the following days, she had made it her mission to monitor his every movement, interpreting his compliance with medical orders as deliberate insubordination. She began documenting what she called incidents, writing reports that painted Brian as a disruptive, uncooperative patient who refused to follow hospital rules. The nursing staff had tried to intervene, explaining Brian's medical needs and defending his character. But Karen dismissed their input as unprofessional coddling. She had been working hospital security for 8 years. She reminded anyone who would listen, and she knew troublemakers when she saw them. Brian's age, his medical condition, his exemplary behavior with other staff members, none of these factors registered in her increasingly rigid worldview. Her authority had grown over the months, fed by a hospital administration that valued order and liability reduction over patient advocacy. Budget cuts had reduced nursing staff, increased patient loads, and created an environment where security officers like Karen operated with minimal oversight. She had begun to see herself not as a support service, but as an enforcer, someone whose job was to maintain control through intimidation and punishment. The morning she decided to handcuff Brian to his bed, Maria Torres was at work, serving breakfast to customers who had no idea her son was lying in a hospital bed across town. She had kissed Brian goodbye at 6 in the morning, promising to return as soon as her shift ended. He had squeezed her hand and assured her he would be good, that he would do his walking exercises and listen to the nurses. Brian had completed his morning walk without incident, greeting the familiar faces among the hospital staff with his characteristic shy smile. Nurse Jennifer had checked his vital signs and praised his progress. Dr. Lawson had stopped by during her rounds, expressing satisfaction with his recovery trajectory. Everything had been proceeding exactly as it should until Karen arrived for her shift. She had found Brian in the recreation area, slowly working on a puzzle that one of the child life specialists had brought to his room. His concentration was absolute, his small fingers carefully turning each piece until it found its proper place. The simple activity provided distraction from his discomfort while exercising the fine motor skills that sometimes suffered during extended hospitalization. "What are you doing here?" Karen had demanded, startling Brian from his focused work. "I'm doing a puzzle," he had replied, looking up with confused innocence. "After my walk, the lady said I could use this table." "The lady," Karen's voice had risen. "What lady? You're supposed to be in your room." Patients don't get to just wander around wherever they please. Brian had tried to explain about the child life specialist, about the therapeutic value of the activities, about his doctor's orders for regular movement and engagement. But Karen had heard none of it. In her mind, she had caught him red-handed in another act of defiance, another violation of the order she was determined to maintain. "That's it," she had declared, grabbing Brian's arm with unnecessary force. "You're going back to your room, and you're staying there." The handcuffs had come out when Brian, confused and frightened, had tried to explain once more about his doctor's orders. Karen had interpreted his attempts at communication as argument, his medical needs as manipulation, his fear as defiance. The cold metal had clicked around his wrist before anyone could intervene, before the gathering crowd of medical professionals could process what they were witnessing. "This is completely inappropriate." "Doctor," Martinez finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised in a gesture of intervention. "Remove those restraints immediately." Karen whirled around, her face flushed with the authority she believed she possessed. "This patient has been consistently violating hospital policy. He refuses to stay in his designated area. He's been stealing food from other patients. And he just argued with my direct instructions. He's a security risk. He's a 10-year-old cardiac patient following post-operative protocols." "Doctor," Martinez replied, his voice steady, but carrying an edge of barely controlled anger. "His walks are medically necessary. His behavior has been exemplary. What you've done here is child abuse." The word abuse seemed to strike Karen like a physical blow. Her eyes flashed with indignation, and something that might have been genuine surprise. "Abuse? I'm maintaining order. I'm ensuring patient safety. This child has been roaming these halls unsupervised for days, creating disruptions and disturbing other patients." Nurse Jennifer had arrived at the sound of the commotion, her face immediately registering shock and horror at the sight of Brian chained to his bed. "Karen, what have you done? Brian is one of our best patients. He's never caused any problems." "Never caused problems." Karen's laugh was bitter. "I've documented multiple incidents of non-compliance. Just yesterday, I caught him in the family kitchen area eating food from the refrigerator. The day before that, he was bothering patients in other rooms. He clearly has no respect for authority or hospital policies." The family kitchen area was a small room equipped with basic amenities, where patients and their families could prepare simple meals and snacks. Brian had been there at the invitation of another patient's grandmother, who had taken pity on the lonely boy and offered to share her homemade cookies. His bothering of other patients consisted of shy conversations in the hallway, brief interactions that brightened the days of other children who, like him, were facing the challenges of serious illness, far from the comfort of their normal lives. But Karen had constructed an alternative narrative, one where Brian's every action was filtered through her assumption of ill intent. His gratitude for shared cookies became theft. His friendly interactions with other patients became harassment. His compliance with medical orders became defiant wandering. She had built a case against a 10-year-old boy that existed entirely in her own mind, supported by documentation that twisted normal childhood behavior into evidence of criminality. "I want to see these incident reports, Doctor," Martinez demanded, his professional composure barely containing his outrage. Karen produced a folder from her security belt, thick with papers that she had filled out meticulously over the past several days. Each report described Brian's activities in language borrowed from law enforcement, complete with official-sounding terminology and formal accusations. Reading them was like watching a child's recovery process transformed into a criminal investigation. Patient refused direct order to return to designated area. Read one report. Patient became argumentative when confronted about policy violations. Read another. Patient observed consuming unauthorized food items in restricted area. Declared a third. Dr. Martinez scanned the reports with growing disbelief. Every single incident was a routine aspect of Brian's prescribed recovery plan, documented as though it were evidence of deliberate misconduct. The walking exercises became unauthorized movement. The therapeutic activities became disruption of hospital operations. Even Brian's polite attempts to explain his doctor's orders were characterized as argumentative behavior toward security personnel. These reports are completely fabricated, Dr. Martinez stated flatly. You've taken normal patient activities and characterized them as violations. This is documentation fraud. Karen's face reddened further. I document what I observe. If medical staff want to override security protocols, they need to coordinate with my department. This patient has been operating without proper supervision or authorization. His authorization comes from his attending physician, Nurse Jennifer interjected, her voice tight with controlled anger. Doctor, Lawson's post-operative orders explicitly require regular walking and therapeutic activities. Brian has been following those orders to the letter. Medical orders don't supersede security protocols, Karen replied, her voice taking on the tone of someone reciting from a manual. All patient movement must be supervised and documented. All therapeutic activities must be pre-approved and monitored. This patient has been operating outside established procedures. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps and voices in the corridor. Karen had called for backup when the medical staff began questioning her actions, reporting what she characterized as interference with security operations and insubordination from medical personnel. 2 additional security officers arrived, along with the shift supervisor, all prepared to support what they assumed was a routine enforcement action. What's the situation here? Asked Supervisor Reynolds, a heavy-set man whose years in hospital security had taught him to approach conflicts with measured authority. Karen launched into her narrative, describing Brian as a persistently disruptive patient who had finally escalated to direct confrontation with security personnel. She painted herself as a dedicated professional, attempting to maintain order in the face of medical staff, who enabled patient misconduct through inadequate supervision and permissive attitudes. Supervisor Reynolds listened carefully, his eyes moving between Karen's agitated face and the scene before him, a small, frightened boy handcuffed to a hospital bed, surrounded by visibly upset medical professionals. His years of experience had taught him to recognize when a situation had escalated beyond any reasonable response to the alleged problem. Officer Hendricks, he said carefully, explain to me why restraints were necessary in this situation. The patient refused to comply with direct orders. Karen replied immediately. He became argumentative and attempted to leave the area when confronted about his violations. I determined that physical restraint was necessary to prevent further incidents. Supervisor Reynolds looked at Brian, who was quietly sobbing now, his small frame shaking with fear and confusion. The boy's medical condition was obvious from the equipment surrounding his bed, the surgical dressings visible beneath his hospital gown, the pallor of his skin that spoke of recent trauma and ongoing recovery. This patient is 10 years old and recovering from cardiac surgery, Dr. Martinez stated, his voice carrying the authority of his medical expertise. He was following prescribed post-operative protocols when Officer Hendricks chose to restrain him with handcuffs. This is not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous to his medical condition. The tension in the room was palpable, with Karen standing rigid in her conviction that she had acted appropriately, while the medical staff radiated barely controlled outrage at what they viewed as an unconscionable abuse of authority. Supervisor Reynolds found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to defuse a situation that seemed to have no clear resolution, satisfactory to all parties. It was at this moment that the sound of clicking heels echoed down the corridor, approaching with the measured pace of someone accustomed to authority. The footsteps were followed by voices, hospital staff members greeting someone with obvious respect and recognition. The conversation in Brian's room gradually fell silent as the approaching presence seemed to command attention even from a distance. "Good morning, Dr. Martinez," came a clear, authoritative voice from the doorway. "I heard there was some kind of disturbance on the pediatric floor." Dr. Martinez turned toward the voice, his expression immediately shifting to one of professional respect mixed with relief. "Mrs. Torres," he said, using the formal address that hospital protocol required. "Yes, we have a situation here that requires immediate attention." The woman who entered the room commanded attention without effort. She was in her 70s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and wearing a tailored navy suit that spoke of both taste and authority. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in complex situations. She moved with the confident grace of someone who had never doubted her right to be wherever she chose to be. Karen, who had been prepared to defend her actions against medical staff and even her own supervisor, suddenly found herself face to face with someone whose authority superseded everyone else in the room. She recognized the woman immediately, though they had never been formally introduced. Everyone who worked at St. Catherine's Medical Center knew Eleanor Torres, the hospital's founder and primary benefactor, whose vision and generosity had created the institution that employed them all. But it was Brian who provided the most telling reaction to the woman's arrival. Despite his tears and fear, despite the handcuffs that still bound him to the bedrail, his face lit up with genuine joy and relief. "Grandma," he called out, his voice breaking with emotion. "Grandma, I did my walking like the doctor said. But the lady says I was bad, and she put these things on me, and I don't understand what I did wrong." The silence that followed was profound and absolute. Every person in the room suddenly understood that the dynamic had shifted in ways that none of them had anticipated. Karen's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, a growing horror as the implications became clear. Eleanor Torres approached her grandson's bed with measured steps, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of his condition: the medical equipment, the restraints, and, most importantly, the fear and confusion written across his young face. She had built this hospital from nothing, had overseen every aspect of its development, had established the policies and procedures that were supposed to ensure that patients received compassionate, appropriate care. "Remove those restraints immediately," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Karen, suddenly understanding the magnitude of her situation, fumbled for her keys with shaking hands. The handcuffs that had seemed so necessary just moments before now felt like evidence of her catastrophic misjudgment. She unlocked them quickly, stepping back as Brian rubbed his wrist where the metal had chafed against his skin. Eleanor sat carefully on the edge of Brian's bed, her hand gently stroking his hair as she examined the red marks the handcuffs had left on his wrist. Her voice, when she spoke to him, was soft and loving, a grandmother comforting her frightened grandchild. "It's all right, sweetheart," she murmured. "You didn't do anything wrong. You were exactly right to do your walking exercises. Dr. Lawson told me how well you've been following all your instructions." Brian clung to his grandmother's hand, the security of her presence allowing him to finally release the fear and confusion he had been holding inside. "I was scared. Grandma, I didn't know why she was so angry with me. I tried to explain about the walking, but she wouldn't listen. Eleanor's eyes lifted from her grandson to survey the room, taking in the faces of the medical staff, the security personnel, and finally settling on Karen with an expression that was far more dangerous than anger. It was disappointment, deep and profound. The disappointment of someone who had trusted others to uphold the values she had tried to build into the very foundation of the institution. "Officer Hendricks," she said, her voice returning to its formal, authoritative tone. "I would like you to explain to me exactly how you determined that handcuffing my grandson to his hospital bed was an appropriate response to a 10-year-old cardiac patient following his doctor's orders." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but found that her carefully constructed narrative of patient misconduct and security necessity suddenly seemed utterly inadequate. The incident reports that had seemed so official and justified just minutes before now appeared to be exactly what Dr. Martinez had called them: documentation fraud designed to support an abuse of authority. The patient was," she began, then stopped, realizing that every word she had used to describe Brian's behavior would now be heard by his grandmother, the woman whose vision had created the hospital, whose values were supposed to guide every interaction within its walls. "The patient was what?" Eleanor prompted, her tone indicating that she expected a complete and honest answer. "He was walking in the corridors without supervision," Karen finally managed. "Multiple times. I documented repeated incidents of unauthorized movement and non-compliance with hospital policies." Eleanor's expression remained steady, but something in her eyes suggested that she was calculating the full scope of what she was hearing. "Unauthorized movement. You mean the walking exercises prescribed by Dr. Lawson as part of his post-operative recovery protocol?" "I wasn't. Medical orders don't. Security protocols require." Karen's attempts at explanation faltered as she realized that every justification she offered only highlighted the absurdity of her actions. "Doctor," Martinez stepped forward, his professional composure now supported by the knowledge that the hospital's founder was witnessing the situation firsthand. "Mrs. Torres, Brian has been an exemplary patient. His walking exercises are medically necessary and have been performed exactly as prescribed. Officer Hendricks has documented normal patient activities as policy violations and has characterized routine recovery behaviors as misconduct." Eleanor nodded slowly, her understanding of the situation crystallizing. She had spent decades building St. Catherine's Medical Center on the principle that patients, especially children, deserved not just medical excellence but compassionate care that recognized their vulnerability and supported their healing process. What she was witnessing represented a fundamental betrayal of everything she had worked to create. "Supervisor Reynolds," she said, turning to the security supervisor who had remained silent throughout the confrontation. "How long has Officer Hendricks been employed by hospital security?" "8 years, ma'am," Reynolds replied, his voice tight with the recognition that his department had become the center of a crisis that would have far-reaching consequences. "And in those 8 years, has she received training on appropriate interactions with pediatric patients? Has she been educated about the medical necessity of post-operative walking protocols? Has anyone in the security department explained to her that our role is to support patient care, not to intimidate children recovering from surgery?" Each question hit like a carefully aimed arrow, exposing not just Karen's individual misconduct, but the systemic failures that had allowed such a situation to develop. Reynolds found himself defending not just one officer's actions, but the entire culture of his department. "Ma'am, we follow established protocols for patient supervision and security," he said carefully. Officer Hendricks was implementing what she understood to be appropriate enforcement measures. Appropriate enforcement measures, Eleanor repeated, her voice carrying a note of incredulity. Against a 10-year-old boy recovering from heart surgery. Handcuffs. On a child. In my hospital. The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just the resolution of an individual incident, but a moment that would reshape policies and procedures throughout the institution. Eleanor Torres had not built St. Catherine's Medical Center to become a place where children were treated as criminals for following their doctor's orders. Nurse Jennifer, who had been caring for Brian throughout his stay, found her voice. Mrs. Torres, Brian has been nothing but polite and cooperative throughout his hospitalization. He's actually helped comfort other children on the ward. His walking exercises have been perfectly appropriate and medically necessary. What happened here today was completely unjustified. Eleanor nodded, her hand still resting protectively on Brian's shoulder. Thank you. Jennifer, your advocacy for your patients is exactly what I expect from the nursing staff at this hospital. She turned back to Karen, her expression now carrying the full weight of her authority and disappointment. Officer Hendricks, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Your badge, your keys, and any other hospital property will be turned in to Supervisor Reynolds before you leave the premises. You will not return to this hospital in any capacity. Karen's face went white. Mrs. Torres, please. I was just doing my job. I was trying to maintain order and ensure patient safety. If I made an error in judgment, I can learn from it. I can do better. Your error in judgment, Eleanor replied evenly, was in believing that terrorizing a sick child was somehow part of your job. Your error was in documenting fabricated violations to justify abuse of authority. Your error was in fundamentally misunderstanding what it means to work in a healing environment. She stood up from Brian's bedside, her full height and presence commanding the room. But your errors are symptoms of a larger problem, one that I intend to address comprehensively. Dr. Martinez, I want a full review of all security interactions with pediatric patients over the past year. I want every incident report involving children examined for accuracy and appropriateness. Dr. Martinez nodded. Of course, Mrs. Torres. We'll begin immediately. Supervisor Reynolds, I want a complete review of security department training protocols, especially as they relate to patient rights and appropriate use of authority. Every security officer in this hospital will be retrained on their role as patient advocates, not enforcers. Reynolds, understanding that his department's future depended on his response to this crisis, nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. We'll implement comprehensive reforms immediately. Eleanor turned back to her grandson, her expression softening as she focused on his well-being. Brian, sweetie, I want you to know that what happened here was wrong. You did nothing wrong. You were brave and you followed your doctor's instructions exactly as you should have. I'm proud of you. Brian's eyes filled with tears again, but these were tears of relief rather than fear. I thought I was in trouble. Grandma, I thought I had done something bad. You didn't do anything bad, Eleanor assured him, her voice gentle but firm. And I'm going to make sure that nothing like this ever happens to you or any other child in this hospital again. As Karen gathered her belongings and prepared to leave the hospital for the final time, the full impact of her actions began to settle over her. She had not simply made an error in judgment. She had violated the fundamental trust that patients and families placed in the institution. Her need to exert authority had blinded her to the basic humanity of the child she had terrorized. The incident report she had filed, which had seemed so important just hours earlier, now appeared to be exactly what they were: the documented thoughts of someone who had allowed power to corrupt her understanding of her role. Each violation she had recorded was actually evidence of Brian's courage, his determination to follow medical advice despite his fear and discomfort. "Doctor," Martinez watched Karen leave, then turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Torres, I want to apologize for not intervening sooner. We all knew that Brian was following appropriate protocols, but we didn't recognize how Officer Hendricks was documenting his activities." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "The failure here was systemic. Dr. Martinez, one person's abuse of authority was enabled by policies that weren't clear enough and oversight that wasn't comprehensive enough. We all bear responsibility for creating an environment where this could happen." Over the following days, as Brian continued his recovery, under the watchful and protective eyes of his medical team, Eleanor Torres initiated a comprehensive review of hospital policies and procedures. The incident had revealed gaps in communication between departments, unclear protocols for patient rights, and insufficient training for support staff who interacted with vulnerable patients. The story of what had happened to Brian spread throughout the hospital community, but rather than being whispered as gossip, it became a catalyst for positive change. Medical staff, who had witnessed similar inappropriate behavior from security personnel, came forward with their own observations. Patients and families shared experiences that highlighted the need for better advocacy and protection. Eleanor established a patient rights committee with representatives from medical staff, nursing, social services, and patient advocacy organizations. She created new protocols that explicitly protected patients' rights to follow medical orders without interference from non-medical personnel. She instituted regular training programs that emphasized the hospital's mission of compassionate care and the role that every employee played in supporting that mission. Most importantly, she created mechanisms for patients and families to report concerns about their treatment without fear of retaliation or dismissal. Brian's experience had shown her that even in an institution built on principles of compassionate care, vulnerable patients could be victimized by those who were meant to protect them. 2 weeks after the incident, Brian was discharged from the hospital with a fully healed surgical site and a heart that was finally working as it should. His walking exercises had paid off, his strength had returned, and his future was bright, with possibilities that had been unimaginable before his surgery. On the day of his discharge, Eleanor Torres personally visited Brian's room to see him off. She brought with her a special gift, a certificate naming him as the hospital's first patient advocate ambassador, a role that would allow him to visit other children facing similar medical challenges and share his story of courage and recovery. "Brian," she said, presenting him with the certificate, "what you went through was wrong, but how you handled it was exactly right. You were brave. You followed your doctor's orders, and you never gave up hope. Those are exactly the qualities we want other children to see." Brian studied the certificate with wide eyes, running his fingers over the official seal and his printed name. "Does this mean I can help other kids who are scared about their operations?" "If you want to," Eleanor replied, "and only when you're feeling strong and ready. But I think your story could help other children understand that they can be brave too, and that there are people here who will always protect them and advocate for them." As Maria Torres packed her son's belongings and prepared to take him home, she reflected on the journey they had traveled together. The surgery had been successful, but the real healing had come from witnessing a community rallying around her son, protecting him, and ensuring that his experience would improve conditions for other children. "Mom," Brian said as they prepared to leave, "Grandma Eleanor said that what happened to me helped make the hospital better for other kids. Do you think that's really true?" Maria smiled at her son, marveling at his resilience and his instinctive concern for others, even after his own traumatic experience. I think it's very true. Mijo. Sometimes difficult things happen so that we can learn and grow and protect other people. 3 months later, Karen Hendricks faced criminal charges for child abuse and official misconduct. The incident reports she had filed were used as evidence of her systematic harassment of Brian, and her use of restraints on a child patient was characterized by prosecutors as a clear violation of his civil rights. The case became a landmark in patient rights law, establishing precedents for the protection of vulnerable patients in healthcare settings. But the real victory was not in the courtroom. It was in the pediatric ward of St. Catherine's Medical Center, where new policies ensured that children like Brian could focus on their recovery without fear of intimidation or abuse. It was in the training programs that taught every hospital employee to see patients as human beings deserving of dignity and respect. It was in the Patient Rights Committee that gave voice to concerns and complaints before they could escalate into crises. Eleanor Torres continued her work as the hospital's founder and primary advocate. But the incident with her grandson had reminded her of why she had started the institution in the first place. Hospitals were not just buildings filled with medical equipment. They were sanctuaries where people at their most vulnerable moments should find not just healing, but hope. Not just treatment, but compassion. A year later, Brian Torres returned to St. Catherine's Medical Center for his annual cardiac checkup. His heart was strong, his recovery complete, and his spirit undaunted by the challenges he had faced. As he walked through the corridors where he had once been handcuffed to a bed for following doctor's orders, he was greeted by nursing staff who remembered his courage and by other young patients who had heard his story. In the room where his trauma had unfolded, a plaque now hung on the wall, dedicating the space to the principle that every patient, regardless of age or condition, deserved to be treated with dignity, respect, and compassion. The Brian Torres Patient Rights Room served as a reminder that healing required not just medical expertise, but human kindness. Dr. Martinez, who had witnessed the original incident, often used Brian's story in his teaching, helping medical students understand that advocating for patients sometimes meant standing up to authority, speaking truth to power, and never forgetting that behind every medical case was a human being deserving of protection and care. As Brian grew older, he carried with him the lessons learned during his hospitalization, that courage meant doing the right thing even when it was difficult, that standing up for yourself was important, and that sometimes the people who seemed most powerful were actually the most frightened. His experience had taught him that healing involved not just his body, but his understanding of justice, compassion, and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The chain of command that had once allowed a security officer to abuse a vulnerable child had been broken and rebuilt, link by link, into a structure that prioritized patient welfare above all else. Eleanor Torres's vision of a hospital that truly healed, not just bodies but spirits, had been tested and ultimately strengthened by the crisis that could have destroyed it. In the end, Brian's story became more than just an account of institutional failure and redemption. It became a testament to the power of speaking truth, the importance of standing up for the vulnerable, and the possibility that even our worst moments can become catalysts for positive change. The handcuffs that had once bound him to a hospital bed had ultimately freed an entire institution to become what it was always meant to be, a place where healing and hope walked hand in hand through corridors filled with compassion. Years later, when Brian graduated from high school as valedictorian, he delivered a speech about second chances, institutional accountability, and the importance of never losing faith in the possibility of positive change. In the audience, Eleanor Torres wiped away tears as she listened to her grandson speak about turning trauma into triumph. About using painful experiences to fuel a lifetime commitment to protecting others. The hospital that had once failed him had become his inspiration, and the boy who had been chained to a bed for following doctor's orders had grown into a young man dedicated to ensuring that no child would ever face such treatment again. The chain of command had indeed been broken, but from its pieces had been forged something far stronger, a commitment to justice that would endure long after the incident itself had passed into hospital legend. St. Catherine's Medical Center stood as proof that institutions, like people, could learn from their mistakes and emerge stronger. The handcuffs were gone, but the lessons remained, embedded in policies and procedures that protected the vulnerable and honored the fundamental dignity of every person who walked through its doors, seeking healing. In that way, Brian's courage had rippled outward, touching lives he would never meet and creating a legacy of compassion that would endure for generations to come.